Hi, everyone. Welcome back. For those of you who are just joining us, I'm Verena Radulovic, our Vice President for Business Engagement here at C2ES, one of the two organizations that are putting on this conference along with the Climate Registry. I'm looking forward to our next panel, Driving Capital and Innovation Towards Global Decarbonization. As we've been hearing throughout this conference, driving the transition to net zero requires significant capital investment in climate solutions. And many of these solutions are in breakthrough technologies. The good news is that the global efforts to address the climate crisis through new forms of financing and innovation are starting to accelerate. With us today, we are joined by experts who can discuss where and how investment and collaboration can advance decarbonization in this next decade. Our esteemed panelists are John Morton, who is counselor to the Secretary of the U.S. Department of Treasury. Earlier this year, the Treasury Department announced a coordinated climate policy strategy to mitigate the threat of climate change. As part of this strategy, it created a new climate hub, which Mr. Morton leads. He also advises the Secretary directly on facilitating the financing needed for investments to achieve a net zero economy at home and overseas. We're then joined by Ailun Yang, who manages international initiatives for the climate and environment portfolio at Bloomberg Philanthropies, where she leads efforts focused on the energy transition, air pollution, and sustainable finance. And we're also joined by Karen Fang, who's Managing Director and Head of Global Sustainable Finance at Bank of America. She's a member of Bank of America's Social, Environmental, and Governance Committee, ESG Committee, the Sustainable Markets Committee, and she's a founding member of the 1T.org U.S. Steering Council, which is a public-private partnership to advance reforestation and carbon finance initiatives. We're also really lucky to have as our moderator today Rick Sains, who's a partner at Pollination Group, which is a specialist climate change advisory and investment firm. For 2 decades, Rick has advised governments, multinational companies, financial institutions, funds, and project sponsors on the economic transition to a low-carbon economy. He's also widely recognized for his contribution to the preparation of the Paris Climate Summit a few years ago and the implementation of the Paris Agreement. So given that all of our panelists are very, very busy, we're very lucky to have them here. And today's a particularly important day with a lot of new announcements, and we're only 2 weeks out from COP. So this conversation is pertinent in terms of how to move financing and investment towards a low carbon economy. With that, Rick, I'm going to turn it over to you to kick off our discussion.
Thank you, Verena. Well, panelists, it's just great to have you all here. Here's what I thought we'd do for this session, and we only have really about 45 minutes, so we got a lot to cover in a short amount of time. I thought what I'd do is I'd start with John, then go to Karen, and then Ailun. And just for a first go around the horn here, if you could each just tell us a little bit about what your role is, what you're doing. And John, don't give us the whole thing, because I'm going to come back and talk about the slow news day in your world today, given the release of the White House report. But if you could just tell us a little bit more about kind of the things you're doing and your role, that'd be helpful.
Sure. Thanks, Rick, and really appreciate the opportunity to spend some time with you today. I apologize for the very uninspiring backdrop here. We're in kind of temporary quarters, so apologies for the low room rater ranking. I oversee something called the Climate Hub, which is a new function and a new office within the Department of Treasury. It sits within the Office of the Secretary, and so I'm a counselor to her in that role. And my job is, consistent with this broader administration's focus on climate change as not one of many priorities, but really a top priority across government. My job is to make sure that that's the case within Treasury and to work across the very, very, very broad equities that Treasury has, whether it's on economic policy or domestic finance or financial regulation or international development and all of our work through the international development banks, to make sure that we are being, as, and the word is often used in climate circles, ambitious as possible, looking for ways to really catalyze as much impact with the tools that we have as possible. So I have a small team that sits within the Office of the Secretary, and my job is to work across the department to really move the needle. Very briefly, that means that our goal here at Treasury is to help enable and expedite the transition to net zero. Ultimately, that is our kind of North Star, right? We have set as an economy-wide target a 50 to 52% reduction by 2030 and a net zero target by 2050. In order to get there, markets need to move, not just public finance. Private finance needs to move as well. And really happy that we have both, Bank of America on the line, which is representing, that pool of capital that needs to move and is in the process of doing so under some very strong leadership, and also Bloomberg that has been an active, I would say, advocate and agitator for movement across a whole spectrum of issues when it comes to climate. So pleased to be here and look forward to the conversation.
Excellent. Thank you, John. Appreciate it. Let Karen, why don't you just tell us a little bit about your role and some of your priorities?
Absolutely. So as John said, I think the pace to net zero pledges is only picking up by the day. I think over 3,000 large businesses have pledged to net zero. We are one of them. We're actually an early mover. I think Bank of America was one of the first financial services institutions that had an environmental business initiative back in 2007. We have deployed, hundreds of billions of dollars to date. But in the word that John just used, ambitious, my job is to work with Brian Moynihan and Fanuc and our leadership and our board to really deploy. This is the goal that we published in April. A stretch goal for us, but we think we'll absolutely get there. $1.5 trillion capital deployment in the next 10 years by 2030. That means we actually have to help clients on climate transition. It's a very active engagement model. Every single corporate client is thinking about the same issue. Every municipality is thinking about the same issue. Every sovereign with advice is thinking about the same issue. And climate is connected with social issues too. So it is very much about sustainable development. So my job is very simple. Help us get to $1.5 trillion plus by 2030, and really with this North Star of net zero by 2050 that John talked about, but also the UN 17 Sustainable Development Goals.
Yeah, very simple. I mean, what do you do with the rest of your day? Yeah, exactly. Okay, thank you. Eileen, please tell us a little bit about your role at Bloomberg.
Thank you. Very happy to be here today. So my name is Eileen. I work at the environment team of Bloomberg Philanthropies, which manage all of Mike Bloomberg's philanthropic activities. The mission of our foundation is to ensure the greatest number of people to have the longest and better life. And to that end, of course, climate change is a very big priority for us. And in our, and Mike also serves as the UN Special Envoy for climate ambition and the solutions. And so in that role, we have three priorities. One, of course, is energy transition. And we work in US, Europe, but also increasingly in developing countries. The second role is try to mobilize local actions, both business, but also cities and states and provinces. And the last one is sustainable finance, because we do think that the financial sector, of course, have a very major role to play here. I guess my daily job is trying to think about the philanthropy dollar, although smaller in scale, but being the most nimble, the part of money that can take on the most risk, and also not for profit, can really also contribute to the efforts here. And so how can we spend this pot of money most strategically is my job.
Well, that's excellent. And I want to come back to that. And I want to come back to the conversation about all three parties, all three of you in your roles as examples of the broader constituencies you represent, and how to think about not just your individual roles, but what is your role collectively and together. And we'll get there. But let me start with John. Given that I woke up this morning, as I do, picked up my phone, started wondering what are the key things I need to worry about today. And the first thing I saw was Wall Street Journal article talking about something you've been intimately involved in. So could you just tell us a little bit about the news for today and the White House's roadmap, and give us a sense? And if you could just describe how you think what you're announcing today and what's going to roll out over the coming months, how it actually relates to this question of driving capital towards innovation and decarbonization. Because there's risk, there's opportunity, there's innovation. And part of what we're looking at on the announcement today is sort of the risk question and understanding that. But if you could speak to what you think the impact is going to be on driving innovation towards decarbonization, that would be great.
Let me start with that, and then come back to the announcement today, and then there'll be, I think, from a Treasury perspective, there's bigger announcements yet to come in the next couple of weeks. So I'll maybe tickle you folks with some of those as well. On the first question, I think the job of government in large part, I think, around climate is to the job of this government, I should say, this administration, is to provide clarity, certainty, and as much certainty around direction of travel as possible, so that financial markets begin to or continue to, in some cases, and begin to, in other cases, begin to understand that this transition to net zero is not a question. It's not a question of if, but a question of when, how quickly, whether that transition is orderly or disorderly, whether industries are leading or left behind, whether assets are protected or stranded. And I think what this administration is trying to do across its broad suite of equities is to indicate to financial markets that this transition is for real. It's occurring not just in the US, but globally. We're just coming from a regulatory roundtable here with regulatory leaders from around the world. And climate was issue number one on the agenda, right? Because this is a transition that is occurring. And again, the question is as much about capitalizing on that and creating opportunity as it is about protecting downside risk. So I do think, you asked about how we play into this. We play in, I think, by setting signals, setting standards, regulation for sure, but the leadership and the direction of travel standard that we can set, I think, is critically important. That gives Bank of America, it gives others more clarity and certainty that what they're doing is, has the full faith and credit to some extent of the government. And again, I think where Eileen raised the point about the types of capital, the type of capital that Bloomberg Philanthropies and others are able to bring to the table are absolutely critical, because they are able to be flexible de-riskers of some of that initial transition work, whether it's on policy reform, whether it's on first loss investment vehicles, whether it's on important advocacy work, whether it's on TCFD development and standards around disclosure. All of those things are critical to creating clarity and certainty around direction of travel. So that's point number one. I'll be quick on number 2 and 3. Number 2, today the White House released it's Section 2 of the executive order from May of this year, May 20th of this year, called for the administration to put forth a roadmap around climate-related financial risk for the government itself. And what you saw today was a series of both announcements and kind of aggregated efforts that the US government is taking to incorporate climate risk into its procurement decisions, into its budgeting decisions, into how it assesses things like retirement savings. And so there's a very broad range of actions and work streams that have been identified and launched today on whitehouse.gov if you're looking for it. It also tips its hat to what will come in the coming weeks, which is the Section 3 report from the executive order, which is the Financial Stability Oversight Council, chaired by Secretary Yellen and the Secretary of Treasury. The FSOC, as it's called, is the group of independent regulators, so the Fed, FDIC, SEC, the alphabet soup of regulators, who themselves have put climate change front and center on their regulatory agenda this year. And in the coming weeks, FSOC, under the leadership of Secretary Yellen, will be issuing its report about next steps among the regulators on how they are going to be treating climate risk going forward. I think that report will have a lot of resonance. It'll be a first step on a much more long-term process, but hopefully not too long-term. And I think it will continue to show, again, direction of travel, clarity, and certainty around where we are going, not just as legislators, but as regulators as well.
That's really helpful, John. Just for the audience, just to clarify a couple things on the FSOC work. So when you say the regulators, you're referring to the SEC, the CFTC. I mean, can you just give us a sense? And there was a mention of the Department of Labor guidelines around, as you said, pension funds. So what's within the remit of the FSOC that you're describing when you say the regulators?
Yeah, so the FSOC was created, during or in the aftermath of the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, as part of Dodd-Frank. It is chaired by the secretary, and it's meant to be a kind of convening forum for coordinating regulatory activity on key issues of national and financial stability, essentially. And so Secretary Yellen, in March, in her first meeting of the FSOC, convening of the FSOC, put climate change as the agenda item. Now, so that was building on some of the work that the regulators were already seeking, to do, and analysis and strategies that were beginning to emerge from the regulatory bodies around climate risk. But by putting it front and center, it really turbocharged that effort. The president then came out with an executive order in May, asking for FSOC to report back within 180 days. And so what you'll have in the next couple of weeks is that report, which is a kind of aggregation and distillation of the regulatory actions being taken across government to incorporate climate-related risk into their kind of observations, et cetera, into their activities. And that's what the FSOC is. Treasury is not a regulatory agency. We can't direct the regulators, but we can help set agendas and steer activities and work streams.
Okay, no, that's really helpful. Karen, let's bring you into this. So you announced just in your intro really ambitious, investment goals, and I noted from the Verena's intro to you, the 1T or the nature efforts that you're doing. Fantastic stuff. And I want to come back to some of that and sort of how you see catalyzing innovation and investments, both within your own institution, but your relationship. You mentioned the engagement strategy. I really want to understand that better and, think about what does that mean for you in terms of setting, same way that John was just describing, sort of the direction of travel in a way. But how does what John said about where, the U.S. government is now going around sort of organizing this a bit more thematically, a bit more strategically, consistently across the government? What does that mean? How do you react to that? What does that mean for you? Does it help you in your mission to sort of, work within the markets to catalyze greater activity, over the next decade?
I think the direction of travel is clear. I think what John went through is first very, very important step is the signal to the marketplace and to financial institutions that have been really focused on capital and liquidity, right? When you think about 2008, what that did was it's a very, very, very dogged motto to make sure we have a fortress balance sheet. We can do our work for consumers and corporate clients that we serve around the globe. And you look at the amount of excess liquidity that every bank in the US carries on its balance sheet. It should make you feel very safe. And I think this is kind of where a risk management focused approach. And I think absolutely applaud that direction of travel. And John, I think it's absolutely crucial, right? And I think this is US government is not alone in this in terms of climate risk disclosure, climate risk measurement, climate risk stress testing, kind of the connected three-pronged approach. It's being taken by a lot of regulators around the globe as well, in the UK and EU and Asia. So we see that coming. It's another issue that's not if, it's when those become even more heightened and more transparent. I think we do need to think about, in order to catalyze, right, John, you talked about the point, being ambitious. I think everyone who is looking at the decarbonization pathways knows that we are overheating the planet as we debate what is a perfect solution. And I think, frankly, we are taking a very pragmatic approach as a private sector leader, right? Because we've been at this for a long time. This is not because it's popular that we started doing this yesterday. We've been doing this for a long time at Bank of America, 14, 15 years. So we realize the urgency is there. What's really good to see is the amount of voluntary activities and people pledging to net zero. You look at Glasgow, net zero alliances, we're now looking at $90 trillion pledged to this mission. But how do you organize that capital and channel that into the most needed critical technologies that's really not scaled and not developed today, right? It's not just wind and solar. Wind and solar and EV won't get us there. So how do we incubate green hydrogen? How do we incubate emerging markets? John, you're doing a lot of great work. We thank you for your leadership with the MDBs and DFIs, but we do need to blend finance, right? It's with Eilun's capital from philanthropic, but that's still a small pool of capital, considering how much more concessionary capital that we need to really make these non-economical technologies, and we can bridge the gap on these green premiums today. So my only thing I would say, Rick, is that climate risk is absolutely one part, and that's kind of connected to the ESG disclosure and broader, set of work that we're all doing. And Brian, our CEO, is chairing the IBC work, which obviously has sort of called on every corporate disclose same set of ESG disclosure. But the last prompt really is a sustainable finance activity part, and that's where we urge the government action in terms of thinking through the lending capital rules and liquidity rules. Because if I lend to the project I'm being asked to lend to today, it's non-cash flowing, it's greenfield construction of green hydrogen plant or sustainable aviation fuel, or lending to emerging markets in the Caribbean to help their clean energy transition, all of those are non-pass credit. So how do we think about our regulatory rules to create a sandbox allowing us to deploy a part of our balance sheet in those critical geographies and nascent technologies that's not cash flowing, that doesn't fit the risk credit sandbox that we have today? I think that's another part we have to think about as well.
Yeah, it's the capital shift that's really important. I mean, so putting the risk in context and properly understanding the risk opens the space for, okay, well, what we invested in as a global economy over the last 100 years is not good to keep investing in for the next 10 years or 20 years. And so the risk understanding begs the question, where does the capital shift to, and how do you get it to shift there? And in the context of what you're saying around, the innovative technologies, the ones that don't have, all the indicia of creditworthiness that you need to scale, you're saying, looking at Eilun, looking at John and saying, okay, we're here, banks are here to do what they can do, but they have to fit within a broader context of risk. And so what can we do to take some of that risk and manage it and use other sources of capital to help so that you can scale quicker? That's kind of what you're getting at, right?
Correct. And just one little add-on to that is, how do we create a catalytic bucket within the balance sheet, for example, that allows us to take on, non-typical, because we're so focused on fortress balance sheet, but is it possible to have a small slice that's not blessed by the regulators is the wrong word, but encouraged by the government, given the amount of the speed and the quantum of capital that's needed here, right? How do we basically get to a point where this doesn't become problem credit? Because even with the concessionary capital, a lot of these things are just going to be a different horizon, different types of risk, and it's largely designed to lend to something totally different than what we're talking about here.
So that's great. So this conversation is naturally moving to where I wanted to go on the collective and thinking about, the blend of capital. But Eilun, before I go to you, I just want to touch on one other piece with you, Karen, and John. You mentioned this. You said, to what degree is a transition going to be orderly or disorderly? And obviously, it's all of our hopes that the transition can be ambitious, relevant, related to the science. And the longer it takes to sort of really engage the transition, the less orderly it's going to be, one way or the other. So my question to you is, what is your role? How do you see carbon markets, offsets, playing into the context of this critical transition and some of the leadership work that the bank's been doing in those areas? Because that's a big area right now. A lot of people are, have views on carbon markets, offsets, and all the like to get to net zero. Can you just speak to a little bit about your views on that?
I think we take, again, a very pragmatic approach. We don't want perfect be the enemy of the good. What we think about this is, right now, before all the green technologies, for lack of a better word, are ready and mature and are scalable, what we really got to focus on is all solutions available to mankind. So when we think about nature nature-based solutions like reforestation. Take a very, very simple thing, right? That is much more controversial when you talk about protecting existing forests. But I don't think anyone can really argue planting a tree is better than not planting a tree. So that's why when you focus on reforestation type of carbon removal solutions, it's not carbon avoidance, it's carbon removal, right? Very simple, or protecting mangroves and coastal wetlands and actually really restore those. You have a lot of biodiversity and jobs benefit, but even just coming back to climate alone, you can quantify with high degree of confidence by having those and not having those, what's the carbon removal benefit. So we want to do that. And I think we welcome a regulatory framework or even just a consensus from the standard setters like SBTIs of the world and Rocky Mountain and WEF, and everyone's working on the sector pathways, is to allow each industry sector, depending on the technologies available to them, to use nature-based solutions and other carbon offset solutions simultaneously and reduce the reliance on that over time as technology solutions come back online, right? You can have a cap on how many of your scope 1, 2, 3 emissions you can offset using these solutions, so you don't become lazy and not focus on the real technology development. But eventually technology will come online. Is it 5 years? Is it 10 years? I don't think anyone knows. But meanwhile, we don't have the luxury to wait. So we have to use all the solutions available.
I was just going to say the exact same thing. We don't have the luxury. I mean, the sad truth is we have multiple crises. There's a biodiversity crisis too, but even in the context of climate, nature it serves multiple objectives and purposes, and it can be a really useful tool to engage in, but not in lieu of deep decarbonization. And that's really, I think, the point you're making. So I appreciate your comments on that. Thank you. Let's move. Eileen. So, in your role, I kind of see you being almost the canary. And this is a really interesting metaphor. The canary in the proverbial coal mine. Hopefully, it's something other. We can come up with a cleaner, greener way of saying that in the future. But you're right on the cutting edge of so many interesting initiatives, and this topic is about sort of the breakthrough technologies and driving capital towards innovation and so forth as one prong of the overall system solution. Can you just speak to a little bit about, what do you see coming forward, and what are you most excited about in terms of the opportunity to actually accelerate what Karen was just saying about when some of these technologies might be coming online from what you see?
Yeah, on this particular topic of how philanthropy dollars can accelerate the uptake of these technologies, let me start with traditionally the 3 ways that philanthropy try to make a difference on this topic. The first one is policy and advocacy. The most important thing is always about creating the enabling environment, which require the government to act, and with John and the U.S. government back, that help solve the problem, a big part of the problem. But of course, in many countries, even for some of the proven technologies, as Karen mentioned, solar and wind, but the enabling environment policy might not yet be there. So there's still a way to go to make sure that we have the type of policy environment. The good news is that I do feel like the philanthropy dollars can scale back a lot on public awareness, pressure, or corporate awareness. I think that conversation we've sort of moved on. We used to have to spend a lot of money to also organize protests and shout outside, but now it feels like even just the last 1 year, there's really an explosive corporate commitment into this topic. The second area philanthropy dollar normally try to make a difference on this is the technical assistance or the upstream project preparation. So try to really put things together and to build the capacity so that there could be more bankable projects in the pipeline for people to invest in. And I think that is on that front, again, philanthropy dollar can play a role, but that is still more of the job of bilateral or multilateral fundings. So they're the question of how we can use our nimbleness to work together with more maybe more bureaucratic processes to speed that up. But I think that there's appetite for really well-prepared projects, and we really have to also speed that up. The last part, I would think, is probably where the innovation comes from now, is to use the philanthropy dollar really as tool to de-risk. And John mentioned about we are the de-risker, de-risking funding, and I think that's to how we put the philanthropy dollar into products or vehicles that can actually accelerate the project. That I think is really some new innovations that we're trying to work out. We've seen a lot of examples, very nice experiments. None of them have yet been on a quite big level. I think that, but we've definitely gathered a lot of lessons, and I think that there's a few philanthropic initiatives right now that's really try to bring this to scale. So how maybe a few philanthropists might come together to build up a platform where it can really be the go-to place, because there's a scale of philanthropy dollar that can actually be deployed for this purpose. But I want to also say that for this pot of money, it is important to both look at the type of industries that we want to scale up. For solar, wind are easy ones, but there's also the more greenfield technologies. However, it's also important to look at this pot of money as playing a role to help take things out of the system. For example, we're working with the Asian Development Bank to look at how some of these fundings can help retire coal-fired plants earlier. I think that we need both mechanisms to get a lot of these technologies scale up quickly, but also take some of the fossil fuel and dirtier technologies out of the system quickly as well.
That's fantastic. I mean, it's almost as if you saw my notes on my next question. I just want to get reactions to the last thing you just said, Eileen, about the decarbonization and taking existing and decommissioning, if you will, the transition of coal in particular. I mean, the three of you on this panel could each play an interesting role there. John, any comments on that? Anything you want to mention about your thoughts on coal decommissioning and the role of blended capital?
Sure, I'll do that, and then take the floor to make one other comment. So I'll make two here. First of all, to get to Paris goals, to get to 1.5, to get to 2 degrees, whatever the goal is, that's 2 degrees or more, we have to do three things. We have to do a lot more green finance. We have to stop doing new brown finance, and we have to expedite the closure of existing high emitting assets around the world. You can't not do the third and get to our targets. So we have to figure out ways to finance the expedited transition of existing high emitting assets around the world. And coal is a great example because it's an industry, it's clear, you have point sources. So we, the US government, is working very closely. For example, I just got back from South Africa 2 weeks ago, working with the government there, working with India, Indonesia. Think middle income, high emitting, coal-intensive economies that know they need to transition for various reasons, largely economic, by the way, not always the simple environmental or human health reasons. But a lot of these coal facilities around the world, there's been great analysis that shows that they actually operate at a loss. So the question there is, how do you finance those in clever ways that deal with the just transition elements of communities being affected? How can you design? And by the way, it's the same issue we face here in the U.S., right? Which has held us back historically from being as quick to to re-engineer our own electricity sector. But anyway, that's a very big focus of ours. The U.S. government has done a lot over the last 8 months to position money, capital, and intentionality around this issue of coal decommissioning. So that's the point I'd make around coal. Let me just say one other point. I think it was Karen mentioned the point around the GFANs, the network now of asset owners that have committed soon to be 100, representing close to 100 trillion of assets under management, who have committed to a net zero pathway, not just by 2050, not being just net zero by 2050, but like science-based 2030 targets.
Mm-hmm.
That's a wonderful thing, right? That number 8 months ago was 4 trillion. So, we've had $96 trillion worth of AUM commit to net zero in the last 8 months. That's amazing. Okay, how do we operationalize that?
Yeah.
You think it's like an hourglass. You put a lot of capital at the top, now you got to get it at the bottom. And the things that are missing in the middle are things like enabling environment reform, not just in developing countries, as we always talk about, but in our own countries. So what are the policy reform and levers that we have to expedite and unlock that flow? Number one. Number two, carbon markets is absolutely a huge part of that, right? Having clarity around the role of carbon markets and the role that they'll play, be it, it will be it will be a important part of this transition period, the voluntary carbon markets. Question is, what does it look like? How is it managed? How is it credible? How is it not, duplicative creating an opportunity for leakage?
Yep.
Disclosure, big issue, obviously, and you'll see a lot of activity around that in the coming weeks and months, I believe. And then the question around what constitutes a climate-aligned investment, these pathways to net zero, we need to work on that. We need more clarity so that folks like Bank of America know that when they're putting their money towards, topic A, B, or C, it counts towards their net zero targets. I think those 4 issues are what keeps this hourglass, it turns this hourglass into a funnel where we begin to see that 100 trillion moving much more rapidly. And that's kind of what we're focused on in government, is trying to unblock that.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
That's really interesting, John. And I know we only have a few minutes left here. I want to give each of you an opportunity to just, talk about what your aspirations are, or your wishes for COP in a few weeks. But just, what I'm hearing is we're sort of moving from this idea that the private sector says, well, we need a signal from governments, and governments are worried that they don't have a safe political space because the private sector is not really engaged and they don't want to force. And it's just completely changed, because like the private sector's, you're talking about the trillions that are committed to net zero. And then the governments are saying, oh, wait a second, in order for us to be relevant, we actually have to start regulating this properly. And it just creates a virtuous enabling environment scenario. We just need to figure out how do we replicate that in the right places as quickly as possible, so that the capital system, actually reflects the whole environment in which we're trying to achieve here. So with a few minutes left, maybe I'll go back to you, Karen. I mean, I don't know if you're planning to go to Glasgow and take your daily COVID test and stand in lines for 4 hours to get in. But if you are, I'll see you there. What are you anticipating for COP, and what do you hope to see coming out?
I think a few things, and I think, by the way, what John said is music to our ears, because I do think public sector needs very strong signals, and people are very afraid. And we talked to a lot of Fortune 500 companies that have net zero pledges or are thinking about making net zero pledges. I would say a couple of things. I mean, John, I think you literally hit on a lot of important issues in the corporate world, corporate leaders' mind. And I do think this coexistence of decarbonization, technology development, and focus on, just reducing your emissions organically and in your business and supply chain, obviously, but also being allowed to use offsetting solutions, credible, right? High quality removal solutions at the meantime. That message is not received. That message is not understood. And so I think just by signaling this is okay, this is actually encouraged because we don't have time to waste, is a huge boost to the confidence, because many CFOs want to use these solutions, but they're afraid of being attacked for greenwashing. So they don't do that. So we don't have natural carbon sinks absorbing the emissions that we're emitting today. I mean, we emit 53 gigatons a year from the globe. We have voluntary carbon offset market was 200 million plus tons last year. Even if we allowed to offset 10%, that's 5 gigatons, 5 billion tons a year, right? So we're just at a fraction, which is why the task force that you're working with, task force with scaling voluntary carbon, saying the market has to grow 50, 100 times. And then to your point, it's about the standard, it's about the fact that we support it. You should do it both at the same time. That policy signaling is super important. But as you know, the standard of this pathway, right? So whether it's SBTI, Rocky Mountain, IEA, IPCC, all the standards that can give us this credible, hey, it's not just 50%, 55% cut by 2030. There is a interim goal. And depending on the industry sector, there is a pathways that people can just get clarity on. We don't have to debate it. And then the question to us then and the GFANZ money that you're talking about, exactly right. The hourglass it's too narrow right now, because people don't know what are the tangible projects, what they are allowed and not allowed to do. The EU sustainable finance taxonomy is very helpful, but as you know, it's very prescriptive, right? And it doesn't translate into capital and risk and credit leeways for banks. So it's a nice set of dictionaries and allowing people to feel that they're climate aligned, but it doesn't translate to incentives, to your point, and action steps or pressure to even use that and to finance more of the climate aligned investments. So how do you make that taxonomy jump to actions is really important, that I'm really hoping to have some really good results out of COP. So blessing the pathways, but the last thing I would say is verification and certification of these offsets, for example, or credits, is really important, because that's the bottleneck. That's why only 200 million was verified and certified. Yeah. Can we use satellite imaging? Can we have the USDA involved? Can we have government bodies involved that will actually have the verification or certification process speed up as well? So all of a sudden we're certifying billions of tons a year, not hundreds of millions of tons a year. So those are the couple of things that we're really looking forward to discussing there, and a lot of the catalytic investments in innovative technologies.
Awesome. Well, I'm sure all of that'll be on the table. I know there's some good stuff going around, digital MRV and really leveraging technologies to take the whole thing to the next level, which is you're exactly right about that. Okay, that's your COP wish. Good. We have a couple more minutes. So, Eileen, what are you hoping to get out of COP?
Yeah, I will be there too. And I'm also optimistic. I think that this COP will really mark the change. That COP is about countries negotiating to actually, this is more about we're in this implementation mood. And the change, if you think about the whole setup from Copenhagen to Paris to Glasgow, the involvement of the real economy players is just totally the game changer. And I think that the attention that business now pay to the COP process, it is not so much about countries negotiating, you do more or less. This is really about business and also the real economy players coming together to talk about real solutions. So that's very encouraging. And I think that for philanthropies, we hope that one day we work ourselves out of this job, that we're no longer needed. Private sectors can run it on their own. That is definitely the hope. We're not there yet, but I think it's looking promising. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's funny you say that. I mean, I always wondered, why do we always have to call it green finance or climate finance? It should just be finance. That presumes that it's some niche thing. It actually should be the main game. And, we should call everything that's not that for what it is. It's the outlier. It should be. And we're moving there. Thank you. John, your thoughts on COP?
Yeah, just funny, your last comment makes me think about, the term alternative energy, for the last 6 years, right? Each year, there's been more renewable energy capacity added globally than fossil energy, right? Globally. And in the US, even during the Trump years, we were approaching 75 to 80%. So tell me what's alternative. I know if you look at the overall, mix of what we have on the grid today, it says one thing, but if you look at what's coming online, it's very different. So I'd like to challenge these assumptions and these wordings we use. Look, I think I just associate myself very much with Eilun's comments around COP used to be kind of a negotiation and, government sitting down and importantly, coming to agreements on direction of travel and agreements that would kind of launch and signal. And I think that was successful. And I think the Paris Agreement is probably the best example of a forcing function for collective global action. Now these COPs are rightly I think a moment to both highlight good things that are happening, frankly, applaud them, try to replicate them, make sure that people are understanding best practices, and also, increase a sense of urgency and, direction of travel. So just in the last couple months, you've seen a significant uptick in NDCs being submitted, nationally determined contributions. You've seen a big uptick in terms of public commitments, public dollar commitments and budget commitments, including from our own government. And you've seen a big uptick in terms of the types of innovative structures and partnerships between philanthropy, private sector, and government. So I'd expect to see those all on display at COP, with some important negotiation outcomes, hopefully as well, particularly as you folks all know around kind of Article 6 and carbon markets, and so we'll have to we'll see what comes of that, but I'm optimistic.
That's fantastic. Well, that was a great way to kind of conclude. I just want to close by thanking all of you for really engaging in this discussion. And I do want to point out that Karen had some very specific, real, concrete ideas around risk mitigation and ways to kind of, think about enabling environments from the government perspective and also at the philanthropic perspective to allow her to bring the heft of the private markets to bear. So hopefully this conversation is one that maybe we all can continue at COP, frankly, for real world solutions. So great. Thanks, everybody. And I guess I'll turn it back over now to Verena.
All right. Thank you to everyone for a really interesting panel, really important, really timely issue. Thank you, Rick, for moderating.